Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of you. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian Garcia. I'm President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank. In an era of firsts, the Green Bank is excited to debut its first webinar series. We want to highlight stories from around Connecticut, the region, and today, the nation, as we confront the global problem of climate change. Today, you'll hear from two luminaries in this field, which I'll introduce in a few moments. In developing this webinar series, the Green Bank has been working with Chair Gillette and the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, otherwise known as PURA, to design the various webinars with the focus on innovative technologies. Through PURA's Equitable Modern Grid docket, number 171203, there is reopener number 5, focused on innovative technologies. This docket is intended to create a regulatory sandbox to support innovative new technology development and deployment in Connecticut. To assist us, in fact, to help lead us on this effort, we recruited Matt McCooey, President and CEO of Connecticut Innovations, the state's quasi-public venture capital fund, and his team to pull together the webinars and to enlist several local entrepreneurs who are developing the clean energy technologies of tomorrow, today. Together, PURA, Connecticut Innovations, and the Green Bank bring you today's program, and we look forward to bringing you more content in the future. Each year, the Green Bank recognizes top-performing contractors and building owners for the CPACE and SMART loan programs. This has been a very challenging year. These honorees, like many of you, fought hard to protect their employees, families, customers, and businesses during this pandemic, while continuing to advance the green economy. Examples of criteria for these awardees include number of projects, customer experience, and whether the awarded building sets the pace as a pioneer in the industry. Next slide, please. The Green Bank's Pacesetter Awards acknowledge contractors, building owners, and other stakeholders who are advancing the green energy movement through CPACE, and whose leadership establishes a pace for others in their field to follow. The award winners are the driving force behind the success of the Green Bank's commercial property assessed clean energy program, which has surpassed 330 loans and nearly $200 million in financing that are estimated to save nearly $300 million in energy costs. These are the projects, financiers, and developers we want to recognize. Next slide. The Green Bank SMART Loan Contractor Awards acknowledge local businesses who are helping families reduce the burden of energy costs by deploying clean energy. And they're doing this by partnering with local community banks and credit unions that have provided those families with nearly 5,000 loans and over $70 million in capital to make clean energy improvements on their homes. This year, we want to recognize the 17 top performers for 2020. 12 of them are repeat top performers from 2019, and we have 5 new to the top performer list. These businesses are headquartered throughout the state, from New Milford to Willington, Stratford to Waterford, installing insulation and windows, high-efficiency HVAC, including geothermal and air source heat pumps, solar PV, and addressing health and safety issues on their properties. These are the local businesses we want to recognize that are leaders in building Connecticut's green economy. Next slide. It's now my pleasure to introduce our 2 guests for this inaugural webinar in our new series. Josh Ryor is helping lead Connecticut's efforts to achieve a modern, clean, affordable, and reliable electric grid. He does this at PURA, Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Josh serves as the state's Director of Utility Programs and Initiatives and will moderate today's discussion. Katherine Hamilton is Chair of 38 North Solutions, I know Katherine for her leadership in advancing the Green Bank movement, but many of you know her around the world of cleantech for her weekly appearances as co-host of the popular podcast, The Energy Gang. So Josh, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for that introduction. And before we get started, I just want to say on a personal note, it's a real treat and an honor to be joined today by Katherine Hamilton of 38 North Solutions and the Energy Gang. For all of you that have followed her career, you know that she is one of the most knowledgeable and insightful energy policy leaders we have in the country. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure. And if you've actually been following my whole career, you're really old. So thank you.
I don't look my age, but fair enough. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started today with just what's your sense of the mood amongst the energy industry in DC right now?
Well, of course, everybody sees this as a big moment. It's a good mood, but it's also interesting because we've kind of, some of our muscles have atrophied a little bit, especially the ones around climate. You know, a lot of people have been engaging on, the investment tax credit. Tax credits are something we do all the time, and people are much more used to working on that than on some other more holistic policies. So while over the last couple of years, the House of Representatives has certainly been churning out a lot of legislation, in a lot of ways, we just didn't think this moment would happen, where you would have a president and a Senate and a House all aligned on the need and the need to act quickly on climate.
Great. Well, so with that, is there a sense in the industry now then that will avoid some of the pitfalls that we've run into with previous administrations?
Yeah, I think there's a recognition that we're not in the same place. So we definitely are not starting from where we were when the Obama administration left off. We've really progressed a lot over the last few years. Renewable energy is so much cheaper than it was, and part of that is thanks to the stimulus that President Obama got through Congress at the time, that really helped to scale some of these technologies and drive down the costs. And just the continued driving down of soft costs for all these technologies has been really helpful. So we're not in the same place federally. We're not in the same place with states and states moving forward, certainly. And we're also in a really different place just from the standpoint of having grassroots support. So back when Waxman-Markey was being considered, and it did pass the House of Representatives, there just wasn't this groundswell of support from constituents on the grassroots level. So that has completely changed, and climate, because it's in our faces, has become a voting issue. And I think that really does change the dynamics on the Hill and elsewhere.
That's really interesting. And I want to put a placeholder in action states are taking, because I want to come back to that later. But I'm curious on your thoughts of the early actions that the Biden administration has taken. Which ones are the most impactful?
So the first, that was the biggest impact, in my opinion, just from kind of changing where we are as a country, is getting back into Paris. So just even saying we're getting back in, where America is going to follow those targets, and in fact, the targets are going to increase, was really important from a global standpoint, because it shows that we're kind of back into that whole conversation. That's super important. And then putting John Kerry in that position also showed a real seriousness about the topic. But then on the national side and, internal to the country, we have Gina McCarthy leading those efforts, and this whole host of incredible people, Brian Dees, who's the director of the National Economic Council, and just a host of folks who are working throughout the administration now, and they haven't even fully staffed up, but really people who are really serious, who understand the need to act quickly, and who can all kind of go in the same direction. So organizing the entire federal government around solving for COVID, around solving for jobs in the economy, around solving for climate, and around solving for equity and racial injustice. Like, every single agency is going in that direction, and you can see that in everything that they do. And Build Back Better is just all part of that.
Great. And so I want to touch on what you were mentioning with the climate, the Paris Accords, and Kerry being in that position. On one of the more recent, actually, I believe it was the last episode of the Energy Gang, you talked a lot about the Climate Emergency Act and that potentially being one quiver that Kerry could bring to the table and say, show, we're taking real action. Can you talk about how some of these other actions, or the importance of the Climate Emergency Act and some of these other actions when we're coming to that international stage?
Yeah, so that would be really stating that the United States is in an emergency situation, and that a lot of tools then are open up for the president to move the economy, move funding around to really address that crisis. That action has not been implemented yet. So I think that still remains something to be seen. I think we don't need to get there quite yet. I mean, we have a lot of steps before doing that. Not to say that we're not at a climate crisis or an emergency with climate, but that there are a lot of other tools that we can start putting into place. And I think you'll see that starting to happen as Congress moves forward. Chairman Pallone is introducing his climate package today, and the Senate will be doing something similar. I mean, we're going to be looking at a lot of action throughout the federal government, whether it's from the executive or legislative branch. And I think Biden knowing he has all these tools is really important. And it's important for Kerry, obviously, when he goes into negotiations.
So how impactful, we all know how slim the margin is in the Senate. How impactful to all of those things do you think that margin is going to be? And is there anything that we're going to have to wait 2 years, 4 years to see moved on?
So I don't think we need to wait yet. I mean, I think we need to move forward. So let's get done everything we can. Right now, they're still finishing up this first relief package for COVID, and then they're going to immediately start working into sort of the infrastructure economic package, the kind of the, not just the rescue, but the relief, the economic relief package. And I don't think we need to wait at all. I think there are a couple things we need to do. One is, yes, you do need to get things done. If you use reconciliation, you only need 50 votes plus the vice president's vote to break the tie. And that means that you really have to bring the entire Democratic caucus together. It doesn't look like Republicans have an appetite to work across the aisle on reconciliation because they see that as a little bit going too far and being too partisan in nature, although I actually don't think it has to be partisan in nature. But while we're looking at these different ways of getting things done with only 51 votes, we can also go through a regular order process, which is to introduce bills in Congress, which is what Chairman Pallone is doing in the House today, and then taking it through regular order, which means like having hearings, bringing forward witnesses, actually talking through policies, trying to bring people along from both sides of the aisle, because this is a climate crisis that affects not just Democrats, it affects everybody. And so, meeting Republicans where we can and bringing them to the table, I think is going to be really important, no matter which side we're on, whether it's the House or the Senate. I think it's important. And the margins in the House aren't very big either. That's a very slim margin too. So I think in both cases, we need to make sure that the conversation brings everybody in and allows people to come to the table where they are. And that doesn't mean you have to water things down, but it really means you have to be pretty intentional about the way you think through policy.
Sure, and speaking of margins on the Democratic side, we've already seen the importance of Joe Manchin's vote, right? So that's one to watch as well. So a question on momentum. What's the momentum? I know you've done a lot of work with the Coalition for Green Capital and working on National Green Bank legislation. Where are we at with that?
Oh, we're doing really well with that. It was introduced in the last Congress and in both the Senate and the House, and we started sort of re-socializing the concept. So it's not a new concept, but for the last decade or so, it's really been percolating in the states. And of course, Connecticut was like the first mover on this. So Connecticut's been able to prove this whole thing out. And a lot of other states have done it in different ways. And there are lots of states that want green banks based on what they're seeing Connecticut and other states doing, and how much help it is to a state to have this kind of structure in place. So this gives us a great amount of stories to tell, a really good narrative in Congress to make sure that we can say, look, it works. This is something that brings all these tools to the table that you can use either in states or on larger regional projects. So we have certainly champions in the Senate that have been working on it. It's still called the National Climate Bank Act in the Senate, and it was for parliamentary reasons that it's called that, and jurisdictional reasons, but it's basically quite a similar package to what is in the House, which Debbie Dingell from Michigan introduced. She's really been our champion, but the House bill is now bipartisan. Congressman Fitzpatrick joined her in introducing it. He is a Republican from Pennsylvania. He really believes strongly in this concept as well. And I think what you're going to see is the need to move forward in a really bipartisan way. This piece of legislation is a priority for Chairman Pallone on Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction for most forward-thinking energy policy and all the policy. So it's not the tax writing committee, but it's the policy committee, and it's not the funding committee, but it's the one that all these ideas for policy move forward. And so Chairman Pallone has really taken up this, what is now called the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, and accelerator is a really good description for what this organization would do, which is not a bank. It really is an accelerant to getting all these projects out the door and to deploying at the pace that we really need to solve for climate. So this has been a key part of what he did in the last Congress. It passed twice on the floor of the House of Representatives in the last session, and it's been reintroduced as a standalone bill and will be part of this bigger package. And we think it's really teed up well to be also part of any kind of infrastructure bill. And if they go to reconciliation, that this is really a key component, because we really need more financing mechanisms to get funding to the states where they're needed, and also to make sure that there is an organization federally that can move forward on regional projects and sort of help make some of those decisions on how all this funding could flow.
Great. I think I just heard an amen from Brian Garcia somewhere. So that's exciting news to hear. It's moving forward. So I know we want to talk about bigger ideas and not just get stuck with talking about the ITC. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you: Are we doomed to this cycle of last minute extensions, or do you think there's a possibility of a long-term plan in the next 2 years?
Yeah, so the Green Act was just reintroduced, and that was Chairman Neal from Massachusetts, who heads up the tax writing committee in the House, reintroduced his bill, which really encompasses all the renewable energy technologies. It encompasses the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. It also has the energy storage piece that those of us who've worked on energy storage have been crawling across broken glass for a long time to try to get that done. That's in there. We think there's even room for other interesting concepts in a tax package, but the Green Act is certainly something that everybody's gotten around from the renewable energy industry, and that would provide a little more, long-term certainty for these credits. Tax credits are a known entity. They're concepts that have been tried and true. They've helped the industry. They've helped a lot of different types of industries, and we know how to implement them. Now, one piece of it that is going to be really important is the direct pay portion, because certainly if you look at who is able to take advantage of tax equity, not everybody can. So really having direct pay would help those who don't have access to tax equity to be able to take advantage of that. And I think that is really important to make it much more of an equitable structure. So yeah, I think that the House Democrats are on board. I think in the Senate we'll see something not dissimilar, and certainly the White House is very keen on this happening too. So I would assume that in any kind of infrastructure reconciliation package that you're going to have a tax component of it that is going to be, include a lot of these provisions.
Great. So I want to move on to the DC Circuit ruling on the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which of course provides a really important clean slate, pun intended, for the EPA in setting up any new rules moving forward. I think we've heard out of the EPA recently that they're thinking about taking a refresh and not just picking up where the Obama era clean power plan left off. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of picking up where that left off and starting fresh?
Yeah, so there was a memo that came from the acting administrator for EPA that basically said, you know, we're not going to support, we're going to vacate, well, the court decided to vacate the ACE rule that previous President Trump had put forward. But we're also, as you say, past the Clean Power Plan. Basically, the EPA doesn't expect states to do anything more on developing and submitting plans under that regulatory construct at all. And you know, basically everything's already been done. We've already met the goals that that plan set forward. So I think what they're going to try to do is figure out, all right, what is our next move then? You know, there are a lot of things that they need to do beyond this. They need to put the, you know, fuel efficiency standards back in place. They need to actually start regulating what the Trump administration had stopped regulating. There are a lot of like PFAS and mercury and all these other, you know, all these other toxics that that EPA is also has to oversee, and there's water safety and water cleanliness. So there are a lot of things that EPA has to oversee. I think on the power plant side, they're really looking at how do we get Congress to support a concept, you know, that EPA doesn't have to regulate, but something more like a clean energy standard, some kind of a goal setting that Congress could do that would drive us in that direction that the Clean Power Plan had done previously. But what's interesting is that during the Obama administration, the Clean Power Plan was was laid out, and immediately utilities and states saw this direction that we were going in, and you know, sort of that in a direction in addition to just economics and the market have really pushed people in the right direction, you know, as we move forward on cleaning up our grid. So there's no need to go backwards at this point. At this point, we need to figure out, like, how do we move forward and what are the structures that we need to put into place? And is EPA the one to do it? Is it through the Clean Air Act, Section 111D, or is there something else that we can do?
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up question on that too is one of the linchpins of the original Clean Power Plan was regional coordination, or the opportunity for regional coordination. How do you see that moving forward in any plan, and the importance of that?
Oh yeah, I think that's really important to look at regional impacts. I mean, the Reggie has done such a good job of this. I think this is such a good model, and certainly, you know, Gina McCarthy comes out of that space. So I think you're going to see a really strong look at that approach and how do we bring everybody together. One thing I think we're going to need to look at really seriously, and I think this administration is very committed to, certainly equity is a big piece of it, but like looking at regions and who's been kind of left behind, and you know, how do we make sure that we bring states along that really have not benefited from the clean energy transition, and how do we work with those states, and do we take a regional approach? Do we do a much more localized approach? So I think there are going to be a lot of different things that we think about, but you know, Reggie can be a good starting point.
Well, sticking on the regional topic, federal regional topic, I guess, I'm curious, what are your thoughts as to what we can expect out of a GLIC-led FERC? And I know that's incredibly broad, so feel free to take that in any direction you see fit.
Well, you know, I love me some FERC. Yeah, FERC is, I've always said, is one of my favorite agencies because it's so process oriented. I like that. I like that you work with facts, that you take in the evidence and you make decisions based on the evidence. That's good. I'm not a lawyer, but I like that approach. And Chairman Glick has said pretty strongly, we're going to make sure that we have a much more rigorous greenhouse gas review process, which the DC District Court had said they needed to, but they hadn't really implemented that in a very strong way. I think he's going to do that. When they look at pipeline approval processes, they're going to really look at what is the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, as they have been told to do. So he's going to take that very seriously. And they have an open notice of inquiry on this pipeline policy. So that's something that people can put comments into. He's created a new position on environmental justice and equity in the agency. So they're going to take that very seriously. He's going to prioritize transmission. because that is super important to be able to, you talk about regional issues, we need to connect regions and make sure that we can move clean energy from where it's produced to where it's needed much more seamlessly, and transmission is going to be crucial to that. He's going to try to continue lowering barriers to new energy technologies, and certainly Chairman Chatterjee was instrumental with orders 841 and order 2222 in making sure that new energy technologies start to have greater access to wholesale markets. It's really, really important to the stability of the grid and also to customer costs. So I think certainly Chairman Glick is going to continue to work on that. And then he's also going to ensure, and this is a biggie I know for you guys too, ensure that wholesale markets don't interfere with state policies, that states can move forward with the policies that they prefer, and that that they're kept separate, and that wholesale markets do not harm the state policies. So that's a gnarly one, but I think he's going to continue working on that.
I was going to say, to keep us safe, we'll just move on from that one. I want to go. Yeah, I want to go back to 2222, which I'm really glad to hear you call it 2222 and not 2x4. Really pushing for that. But anyway,
a lot of people call it 4-2. So
which I couldn't do the tongue roll, so I'm going to pass on that one. But so 2222, obviously a bit of 841 on steroids, I guess, for we had a quick summary of it. Can you just speak to the importance, the market opportunity importance for DERs, providing that market signal and really valuing what DERs can provide?
Yeah, this one is, it's different. From 841 really opened up all of the markets to energy storage, but certainly the utility scale, the transmission side storage was the part that in my mind saw the greatest bump. Now they clarified that certainly so that the demand side was a little bit more shown a little bit more love on 841. But I would say that 2222 really says, all right, you have to consider all these distributed energy resources and how they can participate in the wholesale market and have access to it. So now the devil's in the details on how it's implemented ISO by ISO. And, some system operators are further along than others in their thinking about this and in already implementing some of how would you allow distributed energy resources to participate. And just for clarity, distributed energy resources I see as a whole host of customer-cited resources. So it can be, it can be storage, it can be DG, it can be energy efficiency, demand response, microgrids, anything on the distribution side that can be really, that right now just can't access a lot of value streams. And the more value streams you're able to access, whether it is at the utility side, on a utility tariff program, or whether it's wholesale or both, like let's make sure you can access all of these value streams, the better off the customer is. And the more the customer can participate as a real resource on the grid. I've been working on this, I feel like forever. When I ran Gridwise Alliance back in the late 2000s, I kept talking about this vision of the supply and demand sides being fungible and really the customer resource really being able to participate and be part of the full grid and be a crucial component of that for the benefit of the customer, but for the benefit of the rest of the grid too. And I think Order 2222 is going to start really seeing that become a reality. I mean, we have to be mindful that the stakeholder processes are going to need a lot of voices that haven't been heard before to make sure these Order 2222 is implemented in a way that really benefits everybody. But that's I'm paying a lot of attention to that.
Yeah, well, and I would say too, and curious on your thoughts that obviously technology, both hardware and software, are going to play an important role in ensuring that we take advantage of the opportunities that 2222 is going to create. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on the role of utilities, and if you were speaking to a utility regulator, cough cough, what we should be looking at to make sure those technologies are put in place, and so we're situated to maximize the value of what 2222 is going to provide or present?
Yeah, so that's a great question from someone in your position. It's going to be really, I think utilities are going to be really important. but I don't think they're the full story. So I think it's got to be, we have to make sure that everybody is part of the conversation. The utilities definitely, especially those that are already allowing a lot of participation from innovators and third parties. So, you know, there are utilities that already have tariffs in place that allow for a lot of aggregation and a lot of use of new technology and new services and characteristics to the grid, and having them be part of this and part of how you implement 2222 is really crucial. And making sure that you don't hold those technologies, those innovations to the same, you know, strictures that you would hold a power plant to, because it's different. They're different than a gas-powered power plant, right? On the supply side. And so, you know, making sure utilities would be able to navigate that. But also making sure the voices on the edge of the grid are heard, that the aggregators are heard, because utilities can't do everything. You know, utility has a really important set of skills and, you know, and can be innovative to a point, and Connecticut has certainly done a lot to try to give space to the utilities to be innovative. So I'm very proud of Connecticut for doing that. But you're going to need all of those other providers at the table. You're going to need consumers at the table. You're going to need all of these people to say, all right, if you give me this and you make it easy and you make it less expensive for me, which, by the way, it should be less expensive to access new value streams than more expensive. So if this is like a premium product, then that's not the right answer. You want renewables and efficiency to be cheaper, at least not raise the rates for customers, right? So you want them at the table too, to make sure that that all of these value streams and the way the customers can really access innovation is done in a way that's equitable, that doesn't raise rates, and that the utility can be a real part of it. And the utilities are going to be part of this solution.
Well, and you just spoke about the importance of process too, and to put you on the spot a little bit, is there a jurisdiction, maybe it's FERC, that has a process that you would say is a good model for ensuring that all of these different and disparate voices sometimes can be heard in this process, so we ensure exactly what you were just talking about?
So they're all a little bit different. They all do have processes, and they're in different places, certainly based on, you know, how their markets work. Like I'm thinking of the ISO processes, right? Remember, the stakeholders are the members of those system operators, and so the stakeholders are the incumbents for the most part. So FERC starting this new office that will have much more consumer engagement is going to be really important, because we need to hear from people who aren't in the stakeholder process. We need to hear from those who don't have the resources to participate in the stakeholder process because they can't hire an attorney to write comments, or just because they're not a stakeholder within the formal stakeholder process of an ISO. And so certainly a lot of the distributed energy resource providers have been, and demand response providers too, have been trying to be part of making sure that they're part of that and that their voices are heard. But you really need a rich cross-section of those, you know, to make sure that that happens. And, you know, organizations like the Organization of MISO States, or, you know, some of these, you know, some of the organizations, not just of the state regulatory bodies, but the state customer protection bodies. Those are really important too. So that's, all of those voices are going to be really important. And I'm not going to call out any one ISO over another, because they're all moving a little differently, and I have quibbles with all of them, and I have shout outs for all of them.
Fair enough. I put you on the spot there, and I will give a shout out to our PURA's Office of Education, Outreach, and Enforcement. Is actually, that's one of the things that we asked them to do, is to be a resource for non-traditional stakeholders. So just a little plug there. I want to transition to, and I know we've been flirting with state action, and like you said earlier, I think it's fair to say over the last 4 years that states have really picked up their game, for lack of a better word, and continue to move the progress forward. I think a lot of state agencies and policymakers are seeing what's happening in DC and the excitement there and all of the potential opportunities that we might be able to take advantage of. And I guess my question is, how do we set ourselves up to be able to take advantage of those opportunities? What's the right way to position ourselves in anticipation of that, and also to not get ahead of ourselves?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think states need to continue to go with the policies they're already moving forward on. I think that's really important that we don't stop and say, oh wait, maybe I should wait for all that money to come falling down on my head, right? Like you need to continue to move forward with what you're doing, and I think that's really important. And states have their own set of resources, they have their own, policy structures that need to move forward, and their own legislatures, obviously, and executive leadership that you need to, and types of utilities, right, and utility models. So states need to continue to move forward in the ways that they want to, and I think that's really important. I think to get ready for what's going to happen, there are a couple ways to look at this. One is that you all could actually serve as a model. You could serve as a resource, an idea resource to the federal sector to say, like, look, we're doing these really interesting things. We have come up with some models for how to build a more equitable grid. Hey, do you want some ideas for how you could somehow, think of this in a national construct, even if it doesn't become, obviously we don't have a national utility, but giving some ideas, like getting some of that percolating. I was on a meeting yesterday with Brian Dees and Gina McCarthy, and we were just a bunch of their staff, and a few of us were just talking about what they want to get done, and they are so open to new ideas, and they want to hear from states on like what works, like what have you guys done that's really interesting, and what are the barriers that maybe the federal sector can help alleviate. Or I'm always saying we need better modeling, we need better interconnection work, and resources going to states to do that, so that we're making sure that we're inclusive in our modeling, that interconnection doesn't become a barrier to low-income, housing units, for example, that that we really think about, how can the federal government help without getting in the way. So I think that it's a two-way street. I think one is like bringing your ideas to the table to show our government leaders that like we know how to do this really well, and we have some really good ideas about how to do it. But also, what are the barriers that we have that you all can like maybe help us unblock? And maybe the unblockage is by giving us more money for our green bank. Maybe maybe the helping us, giving the regulatory commission some more resources, technical assistance or funding resources, whatever that might be. So I think it's a two-way street. And I think, looking at the federal government too much as like something that is just, things are going to come down on high. I feel like based on the meetings I've had so far, that's not the way this administration is going to work. They're going to be really a two-way street.
That's great. I have more than too many notes on that one, but that's fantastic. Note to self: I will not wait for the money tree that the national labs are working on. Well, you mentioned modeling, and I think, and that's a great segue to this next question. The Energy Gang had a really fascinating discussion on the report, and I want to make sure I get the name right. Why local solar for all costs less, by Vibrant Clean Energy, and Chris Clack, I think I have that right, the modeler, talking about how solar plus storage is a pillar of the net zero grid, and that, like you said earlier in one of your responses earlier, that should then be a least cost solution, at least in some instances, and part of the whole the portfolio approach, right? So can you just talk us through some of that discussion in that report and the importance of the findings of that report?
Yeah, I mean, what it showed is that it's not just that that you just need DERs to support the grid, but that it has to be combined. You have to consider distributed energy resources when you do a model of like, what are you going to need? What does the capacity expansion for this particular part of the grid look like? And I'll just I'll give an example. And this is in a market that has a fully integrated utility, so it's not a deregulated market, and that is in Mississippi. I've been doing a lot of work in Mississippi. Because for the first time, they're doing integrated resource planning outside of the utility, so they're allowing stakeholders to participate and to some degree. And we're asking a lot of questions about how are you thinking about the future, and the future in a lot of these markets for utilities, and it's based on their modeling tools and their underlying assumptions of costs, lot of which are outdated, a lot of which are pulled from really different types of programs that aren't, it's not comparing apples to apples. The answer to all of their planning is to build a new natural gas plant. So, that's the answer to whatever the model is. And I think we need to get away from that. And I think that's something really important. The regulators need to hold them to task for that. And in this situation, in the technical conference in Mississippi, one of the regulators' staff did and said, where are distributed energy resources? Because they were not even modeled as being a potential, as showing up in any way. So, part of what Christopher Clack has been trying to do is say, like, look, like, not only will they show up, they're really resilient, they're really reliable, and they're really they can be do a lot of service. They're really very valuable to the grid. So make sure that you include that. It will lower the cost of developing the grid. It will, you will be able to lower the cost to customers, because all of these new plants obviously are on the back of built on the backs of customers. And you'll just maximize the potential for all the renewables on the supply side if you can match those up with the demand side. So that's kind of what that report was saying, and I thought it was really important. I would love it if regulatory bodies could start looking at that as something that the utilities should consider when they're looking at their, whether it's an IRP or other kind of resource planning process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and hopefully it sounded like he created that model for a whole computer for that model. So hopefully that becomes shareable at some point for the rest of us. But so I want to talk about EVs for a little bit, and what are some of the creative or innovative approaches that you see states taking to really ensure adoption and deployment, and how do you see the role of utilities in that?
Yeah, I think this is a huge opportunity for utilities. I think that there are a bunch of different things that we have to think about. I mean, EVs themselves are, the market is moving. You hear all the OEMs talking about, all of our models are going to be electric, and yay, that's amazing. They're going to sell a lot more electric vehicles and a lot more different models of electric vehicles. The price is starting to come down. I think having tax credits and having state incentives is really important to that. So that's one piece of it, is an incentive piece of it. But then there's the piece of the charging infrastructure, and I think that is a little trickier because the business model is sort of less really borne out in a lot of cases. So I think we need to continue to work on that, whether it's letting the private sector do that. And certainly with Tesla, they have their own charging infrastructure. That's great. That works really well for people who own Teslas, and they've taken it upon themselves. But I think in other states, utilities are going to want to do that. And you'll want to do it for a couple of things. One is not just for passenger vehicles, but also as we electrify our bus network, as we electrify our, all of the rail system. We want to make sure that we have charging infrastructure, and then we also have a backstop. And I don't know if that is, that could be microgrids or when the power goes down, you still need to move people around. So you need to make sure that you have a charging infrastructure that is resilient and reliable for all of that charging. I think so states doing incentives, states making sure that there is some path forward for a charging infrastructure business model, and whether that's through a utility or private sector, I think different states will do different things. And then finally, really making sure that that customers have enough information about what they need to do. And so I look at this as something really holistic. I think it's something that, EVs not only have the potential for utilities of, kilowatt hours in electrification, which is really good, but they also provide a lot of resilience. So, cars, batteries have a lot of juice and being able to use those for resilience. And you saw that happen in Texas. And I don't mean to say everybody needs to power the car with an EV, but there is an opportunity to use all of these technologies in a way that's very holistic and a way that maximizes their benefits.
That's great. And so you spoke about in that answer both business models and innovation to a degree. Can you talk about the importance of technology and business model innovation in reaching both our climate and our energy goals, whether that's utility, business model, or third party? I'm just curious how important you see that. going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, energy and climate are completely, and infrastructure are completely intertwined. Like everything we do, every decision we make on energy and in our infrastructure is going to impact our climate. So we have to think about that at the same time. And so I feel like your climate goals, like you're thinking you have to clean up the transport system, right? Which is, you know, a third of our emissions are the transport system. So let's clean those up. Of course, that means generation needs to be potentially beefed up. But that doesn't necessarily mean increased emissions. It could also mean that you just use it smarter. So I always think about like non-wires alternatives to make sure that, you know, before you build, think about everything else that you can do before you decide you're going to build a new resource on the supply side. And the new resource on the supply side could also very easily be renewables, like offshore wind. You know, making sure that you can, you know, build those projects in a way that allows you to then supply for the transport side, because that's going to be crucial to meeting climate goals. I mean, there's that, and there's, you know, industry, of course, which industrial manufacturing uses are going to need to also be shifting over to electrification and cleaner processes. And we're going to have to be focused on that too. But to clean up our transportation system, which is crucial to climate change, also requires thinking, you know, much smarter about the energy infrastructure.
So how can state agencies and state regulators think about creating a space for technology and business model innovation? Is that a role that they can help fill, or does that need to come from elsewhere?
Oh, I think it's great when regulatory agencies can do this. I mean, you all have this sandbox, which is, you know, it was test driven in the UK, somewhat in New York State with the REV, and now you all have this, you know, sandbox concept that I think is really important. Like, and by a sandbox, and I've pushed this actually on the Hill as well, to try to do something to encourage states to do this from the federal side. Like, let's give DOE some funds to allow states to do more sandboxes. I think this is really important, where you say, all right, this is a safe space and you can innovate to your heart's desire right here, and we'll give you the tools to do it. And then we'll see, you know, what works and what doesn't work, but it gives you a chance to fail. That's okay. There are a lot of failures, and utilities aren't given permission to fail very often. But if you have a sandbox, you're able to do that, and you're able to test different technologies. And there are areas, you know, certainly utilities like National Grid has done this, where they have centers for innovation. You can test different kinds of technologies, but really having the regulator give them permission to do so is really important. And I think, you know, Connecticut's idea on this is great. I would love to use that as a model to see if there are other states who'd be willing to give that a shot.
Us too. I think I can safely say that. So great. So I want to move on to affordability, which is, I'm sure you know, is one of the tracks, and that's part of our equitable modern grid as well. And I don't know about you, but it does feel like it's an easy concept to talk about and understand the importance of, but often it's easy as a policymaker or a regulator to kind of lose sight of what that means tangibly for quote unquote real people, for lack of a better term. So how should we think about combating the real and urgent problem of climate change while also solving for this immediate issue of energy affordability and energy burden?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you're saying this, because that was exactly what one of the people on the call, the White House call yesterday said. They said, everybody's talking about equity, but how do we actually execute on that? What are things we need to do to really make everything equitable and to lower the energy burden for customers for whom energy is a much bigger piece of what they have to shell out every month, right? A couple of things. There are structural things. For example, you know, people in multifamily housing, they just have less opportunity to access solar, you know, just because structurally, you know, multifamily housing units just haven't had the ability to access, you know, community solar in the way that a single family home would. So sort of sometimes changing some of those structural elements, making sure that programs like LIHEAP, you know, some of these programs, weatherization programs that really try to get funding out to weatherize homes should also make sure that they have access to solar. And I've given an example of a program in Florida, which is one of the green banks. And what they have done is, and they focus very much on the low income market. And they've said, if we strengthen roofs, then we can install solar on those roofs. And by strengthening a roof, we lower the cost of hurricane insurance. And lowering the cost of hurricane insurance by having stronger roofs with solar on them enables them to get solar. So it's this really nice virtuous cycle of we are able to get solar and lower our direct cost as a customer, but we're also able to get hurricane insurance, which we desperately need here in an area that needs hurricane insurance, by strengthening our roofs. And so, it's this really nice way to look at, how do you consider affordability and integration of clean energy resources as like a way to actually make things more affordable for people, not as like this is some special premium product. So that's one approach that I think is really smart. Also, people who have lower incomes have such a higher threshold to prove out that they're able to like actually pay back and have a good loan for doing solar, or be a good solar customer. And I think removing some of those barriers, those structural barriers to people who have lower income is going to be really important. I think there are ways to do that. Certainly through, HUD has some policies, but also state policies too, housing policies too, are going to be important.
Yeah, and that's really interesting on the positive feedback loop there. Be interested to take a deeper dive on that example. So I want to follow up too on kind of inclusivity as well. When we talked a little bit about process, how do we do that, right? It's another one of those concepts that just makes sense, and like, yeah, we need to be more inclusive, but how do we, from a state agency perspective, be more inclusive in our processes? How do we be more inclusive in our program design? How do we effectuate that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I've been involved in another state that is looking at a policy and a stakeholder process to put forward a policy. And they put out the call for stakeholders, and there are like 40 people from the utility applied, and a bunch of people from companies doing business in the state applied. But when I looked at like what are the pool of people that are going to be at the table making this policy, I was like, well, where are the voices of the customers? Where are the voices of people who are in communities that don't have access to a lot of this technology? And so you have to be super intentional about making sure that you reach out to those communities and make sure that they're included as one of the voices, and that you don't have too many of one voice or over another. And of course, that's easier said than done, but you really do have to work to do it. I think about, I'm from a lot of my family's from Appalachia, and I think about what do we need to do in areas of the country that haven't been able to benefit from a transition, and that have dying industries. The coal industry, certain people have not worked in that industry in a really long time. From where my family lives, a lot of them have just been living on government subsidies because they don't have jobs and they can't afford to move because they own their own homes. Because at one point coal was king and they were able to buy nice houses and live in that area, and now it's not. So what do we do? So a lot of organizations in those parts of the country have come together in a way that really brings communities together to say, all right, how do we change this? How do we make sure that we decide as a community, what do we want our future to look like? How do we take advantage of all this transition that's going on? Can we take advantage of that and move forward? I mean, some of that just means getting people broadband. Like, that seems really basic, but there are a lot of communities in this country that don't have it, don't have access to it. All the kids have to go to McDonald's to do their homework. So, I feel like, part of this is, making sure that you take a really community approach and that the community voices are all part of it. And it's not just the same people. And there are a lot of the same people that are really good to have at the table, but I would just say, look beyond the usual players to make sure that you have a really intentionally formed group that can bring ideas that like maybe a little unusual or off target. And I know this group in Appalachia, one of the things that they've done is say, like, maybe we're not going to be the kings of solar down here. Maybe instead we should think about tourism, or maybe we should think about cultural growth, because we have all this, we have music, we're really good at that. So, there are a lot of ways that you can move communities forward. But you have to be super intentional. And I know I've like wandered off into my neck of the woods, but I think no matter where you are, no matter what state you're in, there are communities that are left behind. You have to make sure that you bring them into the conversation. And it's not like putting out a notice. You have to go and get them.
No, and I think that was actually a really helpful example, because I think there's lots of discussion about unjust transition and what that looks like, but it can't be, at least it sounds like from your experience, it can't be a top-down just transition, right? We have to engage those communities and not just say, well, you're going to do solar now, right? There's real engagement that needs to happen there. Well,
yeah,
I mean,
the jobs might not be one-to-one. Like a job of someone who worked in a coal plant isn't going to be the same as a rooftop solar installer. So you can't just switch people out. You have to think about what are the skill sets here. What can you do with those skill sets? Is part of working in a brownfield actually being able to deal with the brownfields itself to make it a better place to develop. And maybe those skills are the same skills that created it in the first place. So like really looking at the skill sets that you have and trying to match them up in a way that you don't have to bring in people from the outside, but it can't necessarily, and Jigger talks about this a lot, about like, you need to bring in the outside people. And I agree, in a lot of ways you're going to need to, but you also need to find really good work for people who already have a skill set, and what can they do with that skill set?
I was going to say, we made it the whole time without one Jigger reference. So that's, I thought we might make it the whole time. But, well, I will, just a heads up for the whole audience, I'll open it up to questions through the chat for all attendees after this last question. So think about your burning question that you'd like to ask Katherine Hamilton. So my last question is a little bit open-ended, and just curious in your thoughts, what do you think the lasting impacts of COVID are going to be for the clean energy industry, and really, any state by state differences that you see that, maybe California is going to manifest itself in California differently than, say, in the Northeast?
Oh, it's such a great, important global question.
Yeah.
I actually moderated a panel. The World Economic Forum didn't do Davos this year. They did this thing called Davos Dialogues, and I was asked to moderate a panel for a group of companies that I like. It was like so out of my wheelhouse, but they were big infrastructure companies. They were big manufacturers, and the question was, like, there are a lot of things that you can do virtually, like what we're doing right now. That we're having to do virtually because of COVID. But guess what? Like, the whole world isn't virtual. We actually have to do things. We have to produce products. We have to like run stuff. We have to move people. We have to, there's so much you can't do virtually. And like, how do we deal with that as we move forward with an energy transition? That is a huge question, that it's not just one part of the US or another that's thinking about it. It's the entire world is thinking about this, and like, what does the future look like? And I would say, to a company, all of those companies that I was moderating on the panel said, we're moving to a world that has to be more sustainable. So we have to think about, what does that mean in the context of doing manufacturing or doing infrastructure, and like, how do we put in place everything that we need to make our future more sustainable from a climate perspective, because as Budweiser says, we want to be selling beer in 3,000 years. Like, let's get on this sustainability train. How do we make sure that virtually we can do this? Like, my office no longer, I don't have to meet all of my team in my office. We've decided we can save a lot of money if we don't have a huge office space, so we can have a minimal space and we can all, work from home because we kind of need to right now. Also saves a lot of money, allows us to be more efficient in a lot of different ways. But certainly, COVID has, there's still a lot of things that have to happen. So you still need to install solar on rooftops, right? You still need to be able to move forward on projects, a lot of which can be done outside. So I think that's really important. Energy efficiency, you can still use buildings that are not yet, I know at one point schools, I'm in Virginia, and the schools are kind of in a weird schedule. Right now, I don't think our schools have even started. One of my kids is in a school that does have school part-time. But take advantage of these empty buildings, weatherize them, like bring them up to code if they aren't already. Make sure we do as many projects as we can. Going forward, I feel like we're going to have a much better sense of efficiency. Like, how can we be more efficient with what we do on a day-to-day basis? Do we need to spend that much time? Do I need to spend as much time as I did on a bus and a train to get to work every day? Although I did get to listen to more podcasts then, to and from, or can I be much more efficient? And during that hour and a half, I can be doing Zoom calls instead. So I think there's going to be a focus on efficiency. But we also need to think about, like, how does our economy keep going? Like, how do we keep doing what we need to do, and be safe with it, and not see COVID as an obstruction to climate solutions, but actually part of moving forward faster. We all got this sense that the air can be cleaner. I live right near National Airport, and for a long time during COVID, I couldn't hear any planes taking off and landing. Well, it's terrible for the airline industry, but like, I got a feeling for what it's like to have a sky that isn't full of airplanes, that isn't noisy. And I think we all got a picture of that during a lot of the lockdown, and that's something we're going to, part of what we need to view is like what's possible. So we're going to be more efficient. We're going to think about, like, we can do this. We just need to make sure we do it while keeping our economy going. And I think we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's really the images out of California and the LA area right at the beginning of the pandemic were just amazing. You could see downtown LA.
Well, and of course, California has had, like, they had all those wildfires too, which have been this like awful double whammy to them of like having wildfires, a lot of which are precipitated by climate events, right? And I mean, this has happened globally in a lot of different ways, but theirs was so dramatic, and needing to find solutions on the ground for customers is going to be really important for them, because you need to keep people safe, but also have power.
Great. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for answering my questions. It was always learn too much to be retained from you, so I really appreciate it. And I want to get to some of our audience questions. The first one I have is from Miss Lovlev. Sorry, I'm butchering that name, so I really apologize. But so she asked, I wanted to ask, in terms of initial actions, there was an opportunity to make a statement by awarding the contract for all new U.S. Postal Service vehicles to be EVs. Instead, it looks like the new fleet will be 90% ICE and only 10% EV. This seems like a really bad sign right out of the gate. The devil's in the details, or rather the procurement. It's all a joke. What do you make of this?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I can't speak directly to that decision. I just had not followed it. I agree, it's a great opportunity to try to get much cleaner vehicles. And my sense is that there are going to be a few steps that they're going to need to take. There may be some issues about competitive procurement that there's some hoops that they have to go through to make sure that they're not breaking any contracts. So that may be part of the issue. I'm just guessing here, because they can't just switch everything over immediately. But I agree, it's a great opportunity that the federal government should be taking advantage of, especially since the Postal Service has been suffering so much. And I think there's a lot of other stuff they need to do with the Postal Service, like getting mail to where it needs to go too.
That seems like that should be first and foremost, but so great. So next question is, should states simply remove barriers to DER deployment and see what happens, or should there be some sort of target for the proportion of DERs to grid scale resources?
The target issue, because of course, if you were following energy storage, having the energy storage targets set in California, like, basically opened up the industry, and 100 companies flowered in California, and it was really a game changer. So, but at the same time, mandating a certain amount of DERs, I think, is tricky. It just so depends on your resource mix and where you can get resources. I think you want to set goals on maybe making sure that X percentage goes to low income, right? That you want to make sure that you spur communities that have not been able to take advantage to date, that you set targets for that. And the targets are good just because it gets everybody kind of going in the same direction. So I think targets are important. I think incentives are really important to back them up. I think mandates are slightly trickier. I think it just has to depend on what the resource mix is in the state. You have to be pretty thoughtful about how you do it, so that you're not saying everything has to be distributed, but that that you have a balance of that. So I know that was a wishy-washy answer, and I apologize.
No, but I do think it's also an important distinction between targets and mandates. And it's a timely question in Connecticut because there's proposed legislation for a 1,000 megawatt storage target by 2030. So
go for it. Do it.
I'll let them, or rather, we'll share this. We'll share this recording with the Energy and Technology Committee. Let them know. Katherine Hamilton is approved. Great. So the next question is: I once saw a map of geothermal generation potential on the East Coast, and in West Virginia had a lot. Not surprised. Has anyone tried to capitalize on that?
I think geothermal is vastly both undertapped and underappreciated. And yes, I am also aware of this West Virginia resource. And what a great way to take skills that were used for other types of extraction to use in the geothermal industry. That would be wonderful. I'm sure there are folks working on it. I have not been working on geothermal in a long time, but I see that as a tremendous resource potential also. And I'm sure it's something that Senator Manchin would be super interested in. And I would note about Senator Manchin, because he gets a lot of attention, I would say, because he is such an important, remember, everybody in the Senate is a king right now. So it's not just him. But he's actually very invested in his state and making sure that there are solutions that that he can put forward. He also has become a big believer in climate change, and that was in part because of a trip to Alaska with the former chairman of Energy and Natural Resources, Lisa Murkowski, who has long been a climate change believer, and he went up there, and it just really internalized it for him. And I think you're going to see a lot more, and his staff has always been super open to really interesting ideas. So I could definitely see geothermal being a big resource for them to take advantage of. And I love that question. I love that we're giving it some attention.
That's interesting. All right, we'll look out for that from Senator Manchin. So the next question is the $1.9 trillion COVID package climate/green energy sensitive?
I don't know. I've been paying so little attention to that, other than from the point of view of once that's over, we get to do the climate package. But but it is so crucial to getting to making sure people can take care of themselves, that they have the health care that they need, that they're able to pay their bills, that they're able to do what they need to do to get back to work. So I think yes, in the sense that it's designed to help people. There's nothing overtly climate related in it, but I think it's critical to making sure that we get back our footing and to get into a space that we can move past having a health crisis be the #1 issue and start focusing on climate and job creation as part of that.
Great. Well, the next question I'm going to apologize for in advance. It's a great question. It's an important question, but it's a hard one to define. So the question is, can you define for us the term equity more specifically?
Oh, gosh. I'm sure there's a statutory definition somewhere that I should be
Sure.
hearkening to. And I think of it as not having impediments and having equal access to whatever the case may be. And it's tricky because there's so many structural barriers to getting things done that you can say, oh, we're going to have equitable rates, everybody's going to have the same rates, and yet there's certain communities that have a much higher energy burden because structurally they're gonna, they have more of a burden. It's not really applied to them. The equitable rate doesn't apply to them. Whereas, we need to think very differently about what it means to have things be equal for people, because people are already starting at an unequal footing. So we need to first figure out, like, all right, what's the baseline of where people are? It's not like you just set this, you just say, all right, now everything's equal, because there are already people that are come at such an unequal place that we need to first figure out, like, how do we then raise them up to a place where there actually is equality. That's not really a definition. It's more the way I would think about it.
No, that's a great answer, though, in my opinion, because it's difficult to any one topic that you pick and say what is equity in that topic. It's really a spectrum and a conversation that has to be had, more so than a firm definition on anything, in my opinion. But I'm sure someone will find that statutory reference and prove us both wrong.
And what you need to realize is that when I tape the show, I have like 800 pieces of paper around me with all my notes, and so when people give me questions that I haven't studied for, I'm like, ooh, but thanks, fire away.
So then the next one is, so home builders and other building trade associations are resistant to greener building codes. How can we move this forward in this realm? Oh, no, I think that's where the question ends.
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert on the home builders and what they want. I think making sure that that the codes are don't involve greater burden or greater expense on their part, I think will be really important. I mean, there are industries that, they make money by selling more of a product, and if it takes longer to build the product, they're making less money. So I think making sure that any code structure is implemented in a way that makes it much easier and more profitable for them to, make sure that they can sell their product, the better. I mean, I think about Energy Star and going to Sears and looking at the Energy Star labels and going, oh, I want to buy this one because it's got the better label on it. And, that product probably did better financially, because you could see on it, on just the label, how much better it was at performance than the other products. And, I think I know I'm going to be stepping in it here, but like making it easier for the home builders to understand that this is like actually could be very profitable and helpful to them, might get you part of the way.
Yeah. So the next question is, it really brings together a few of the different elements that we've talked about today, is what can the private sector microgrid developers do to encourage local governments to invest in microgrids within low-income communities?
Oh, that's so good. I work on microgrids, and it's so hard to do that, because there is a cost differential, and you need to make that up. So I think a couple of things. Green banks, that'd be really good to have green banks investing. The other thing is FEMA has a lot. This is the Federal Emergency Management Administration. So it's like where all the money goes after hurricanes and such, to communities. There are programs right now that communities have access to that include, this is pre-disaster mitigation grants. And this is for projects that include microgrids. For your community, is your community at risk? And how do you deploy this microgrid? And there is funding available through the federal government for that. I don't know how many communities know about it, but I would think a lot of communities that are in areas that are particularly susceptible to climate risk are also those that really need a lot of economic assistance. And so, trying to match that up, I think that is one way the federal sector can help. I've also been working with folks on the Hill for a microgrid tax credit. Now, you'd want to then set it up as direct pay so that you don't have to have tax equity, right, to take advantage of it. But some kind of a tax credit could also be really helpful.
Well, speaking of tax credits, we have a couple of questions here on ground source heat pumps. We talked about geothermal earlier, mostly from a supply side resource perspective. I'm curious, are there any, there's a few questions on, what are the incentives there, and if there are any, what's the momentum around potential incentives, and why does it, for lack of a better phrase, not get as much love as other resources and potential solutions?
So this is definitely not my space. So I don't know what all the federal incentives are for ground source heat pumps. I thought there was a tax credit for them, but they're, it's one of those things that like makes a ton of sense and would be, everybody should have and have access to being able to do that. I don't know why it's not considered more sexy than it is, because it seems like that to me. But I'm sorry, I wish I could address the actual incentives. I thought they were eligible for the ITC, but I also do not work, I don't work in that space at all. I would have to have prepped for that question.
Yeah, and I'm no help there either, so apologies for not being able to step in and give you anything there. Well, the next question, so this is an interesting and timely, and if you can't for any reason answer this one, would be understood. But the question is around the future of green tech media, which produces the energy gain. Will everyone's collective fingers are crossed, will the energy gain continue?
I believe that Stephen Lacey has been very clear that the energy gain will continue. So that's probably all I can say about it.
Great.
I have loved all the people who've worked at Green Tech Media. I've loved those reporters as much as everybody else. I've loved the energy gang. The energy gang ain't going anywhere. I'm sorry.
Well, Peter Millen, who asked the question, says he's a big fan. So I'm sure at least there's one other person that's relieved to hear that. So that's great. Well, so let's see. So there's a couple other questions. One's I'm curious if you can speak to at all the example of the large Tesla battery system in Australia, and if there's any insights there between that size storage and smaller scale storage. If we want to have a more general question.
Yeah. So unless I did a little bit of research, I couldn't speak to that specific project. I think it's a bunch of batteries though, right? It's just like a bunch of lithium ion batteries. I think that's the way.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yep.
So right now, lithium ion is like, it's energy storage. It is the most cost-effective solution right now, for sure, for all of the use cases that we've used energy storage for so far. However, long duration storage is something that we're going to need. We're going to need it to replace all of the natural gas plants that are going to need replacing. So there are technologies out there right now that are being developed to try to look at hundreds of hours of storage, not just hours of storage or minutes of storage. And lithium ion, if you did hundreds of hours of lithium ion, it would be extremely expensive. So, in some cases that you'd probably be willing to pay for it. But in other cases, you want something really cheap. And there are companies that are working on those solutions. There's one that I work with specifically out of Greentown Labs, which is Form Energy, and they're looking at a technology solution for long duration, and which would be more of a seasonal, it would accommodate seasonal differences in when renewables show up and when they are not available. And I think that's going to be important to, in addition to using lithium ion, which is just completely cheap in all of the use cases right now that it's being called upon, still isn't going to be able to do some of what is going to be needed. And I would also mention, I would want to throw out some love for pumped hydro storage too. I started my career at Virginia Power, which is now Dominion, and one of our biggest assets was like the largest pumped hydro storage facility in the world, and it was just crucial to making sure that the grid operated and was stable in our service territory. So, I would say, we may not be building a lot of new big pumped hydro facilities, but we might be able to adjust those. There are a lot of new technologies that are on a smaller scale that I think are going to be really important, but we'll provide some of those same services on long duration.
Great. And actually a quick follow-up on that too is, the national labs are doing such a great job looking at the future of storage technologies. And you mentioned companies that are trying to move the needle. What's the role of, and I keep coming back to this, what's the role of states in that and encouraging other technologies? Or do we not have a role in that and we should remain always technology agnostic?
I mean, I think you can be not technology agnostic and still be okay. I mean, I think what California did with their energy storage goal was that they said, X amount had to be residential, X had to be, utility developed, and X non-utility developed, or something like that. They had different categories, and I think they also welcomed all technologies. So, I mean, the issue in a lot of cases is if you're answering an RFP that a utility puts out, it's the cheaper technology that's going to win out. But I think if you give some other types of incentives, like say, like we're going to make room for some other technologies, I think that's totally worthwhile. Now, that doesn't mean if you have a real need to do a bunch of resilience and you need to get storage deployed really quickly, and I would say in California, Aliso Canyon, when they had the big gas leak, having storage deployed really quickly was the most important solution. So they couldn't say, well, we'll just let flow batteries, we'll let everybody participate. They said, like, whoever can come in, cheapest and fastest gets to do it. And so that's what happened. But I think states should allow for experimentation. I mean, I think that's really important. And I think allowing a lot of different solutions is absolutely justified, because you want to see, there's some things that might work in some situations better than others. Like, let's let a lot of flowers bloom there.
Yeah, and I just put in a plug, like you did earlier, for our PURA's regulatory sandbox initiative, and the docket is still underway, but 171203 REO5 for everyone that caught that and is interested in following along.
You should be interested.
I mean, we agree, but so actually, to follow up on this theme, we have another question. What technological innovation are you most excited to see developed?
This is like, which child do I love best, right? I love them all. All right, so I'll throw out a bunch of stuff, and a lot of this is stuff I work on. But this is one thing that I think is really cool that I have just recently become much more interested in. So one of the things I did last year was I was on a panel with Scientific American and the World Economic Forum to pick the top 10 technologies for 2020. And these were technologies across the board. So there was like medical device technology, there's like AI technology, there was some energy technologies. And I said, I think we need to include electric aviation. And I had never worked on electric aviation, but I just thought, like, that'd be game changing. So I'm excited about electric, it got on the list. I'm excited about electric aviation. I know hydrogen has gotten a lot of press and a lot of airtime. I'm like a little less excited about it. I think there's a place in it. There's a place for hydrogen in all of this, but I'm not like it needs to be everywhere. I think basic, like, grid, I used to call it smart grid technologies, but I don't know, smart grid's not a word anymore. But like, technologies that enhance the efficiency of the grid, like just basically, like allowing things to flow, allowing electrons to move from the customer to the supply side and back, like all that stuff is really important, whether it's from hardware or software. I'm really excited about customer participation. Like, let's make it easy for people to do things, like make it easy for them to make money, which is why, like, I'm not for re-regulation in Texas. I think the retail market is really important. The retail market in the UK has been really important. Like, make sure people, are able to take advantage of price signals and, make smart decisions and make it easy for them. So I'm really interested in, those are like more applications than technologies. I'm really interested in long duration storage. I think I'm really interested in how do we deal with, how do we transfer technologies that have been very carbon heavy, like concrete? How do we, inject carbon into concrete? How do we change the way we do things in a way that makes bad stuff productive? That doesn't mean like, that I believe in, let's like keep burning fossil fuels and then somehow grab all the stuff and use it. I think we need to get rid of fossil fuels. And that's not where I am on it. It's more like if there's a process that has to take place and it creates CO2, let's figure out a productive use for it. So I'm looking at a lot of different things. I think there's so much going on right now. This is such an exciting time to be in energy. It's such an exciting time to be in climate. I mean, it's terrifying also, like, holy cow, things are happening so quickly and it's so dire right now. But I think we also have so many possible solutions, and we have so many people interested in solving, and thank goodness, because it's going to take all of us.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to hear in your answer there that just the interconnectedness of the technologies, both hardware and software, and how it's both, the solutions sound like they're both more complicated and complex now, but more efficient, maybe more, the upside is greater.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, you mentioned Texas, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask, are there any insights that you would wish to share with the group from what happened a couple weeks ago?
So they're probably not going to do the Green New Deal, just to be clear. That's not where Texas is. I mean, I hope they keep their retail structure the way they have it. I hope that they will be open to grid ties to make sure they can move power around, and that they can export clean energy from Texas elsewhere. That's going to be really important. I think they don't want to be in FERC jurisdiction, so there's going to have to be something done about that. But this is not the fault of clean energy at all. And if you listen to that episode, like Jigger talked about it a lot, it is absolutely not the fault of renewables that it happened that way. And it's really not necessarily even the fault of the construct, of their regulatory construct out there. It's really just that they haven't invested in climate solutions, and it's going to be tricky because it's not a place where they thought they would get many, many days of a deep freeze. They've had polar vortexes before, but this was like a real deep freeze. And how do you have to manage for that when it doesn't happen very often, but it could potentially happen a lot more often? And so we do need to change how, who do we hold responsible, and how do we make sure that they do their jobs the way they should? Like, how do we make sure that they invest in solutions now and that they think about it? It's tricky there because it's very fossil fuel dominated, the state is, and it would take a lot to change that mindset. But honestly, there are a lot of people, as one of my friends down there told me, there are some white hot mad people down there, and you don't blame them at all.
No, certainly not. I think it makes a lot of sense that, or it's definitely something for us, even in New England, to take into consideration that these type of extreme outliers are going to happen more frequently. It's just unfortunately the way things are right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be the norm.
Oh. Agreed. Well, I will get you out of here on that. Thank you so much, Katherine, for your time today. It was an absolute pleasure and an honor on my part, and I know that the Green Bank folks feel the same way.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to everybody who listened to me blah, blah, blah on. I hope I answered some of your questions, Josh, in a way that was helpful. And I just, you guys go. You're doing such a good job up there, and I admire what you're doing. Your PURA is amazing. Of course, your chairman is a wonderful person, and she's done such an incredible job. And so, as Brian Garcia at the Green Bank, he's been such a leader in your state. So I'm going to be watching you guys to get my inspiration.
Well, great, thank you. So you will have no arguments here. We have great leaders for sure. But with that, I'll pass it on to Matt Masunas from the Green Bank. I know he has a couple of statements he wants to make.
Hey, can folks see me? Hear me?
Yep.
Hey, thanks, Josh, and thanks, Katherine. Matt Masunas here for my statements. So as another fanboy of the Energy Gang podcast, and of course of PURA hearings, I'm sure there's equal amounts of both fans out there. That was amazing. And thank you to viewers for joining us today for our inaugural in our series highlighting clean tech in Connecticut. Next week on March 10th, we'll bring you the second conversation in our series. You should see it here with another timely subject. Among a recently proposed package of climate bills from Governor Lamont is a set of proposals that includes the expansion of Connecticut Green Bank's mission. And so, hot on the heels of a just scheduled March 8th legislative public hearing, we're going to learn from experts on what that all means. What's in this field of environmental finance, and what's the importance, especially now, of adaptation and of resilience. We'll hear from the CEO of Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank on the very different ways Connecticut's PURA agency works across the border. And we'll hear from other experts. Connecticut's climate change director, Rebecca French, and Joyce Coffey and Wayne Cobley, two well-regarded field practitioners who do this all day. So join us and learn with us. And for the rest of the day, I hope everyone out there feels empowered by the renewable energy of community. So thanks. We'll see you all next time. Take care.